Hello everyone, it's Herbert here. Today's presentation is going to cover an introduction to the ready-made as a fine art concept. So let's begin with probably the most famous example of the ready-made, and it was made by the man who coined the term, that is Marcel Duchamp, and his work from 1917 called Fountain. It's probably the most influential artwork of the 20th century. The repercussions of this work were felt for the rest of the entire century, and it has defined very much the landscape that artists, and you as student artists, you'll be the people who are inheriting that landscape. It's still very, very important, and it's very important to get your head around what the ready-made means for an artist and how it is used. This is the first example that is always pulled out. It's not the first ready-made he made, but it's the first one that was given its prominence. The Fountain, it was a submission to an exhibition in 1917 of the Society of Independent Artists in New York. That society, Duchamp was actually on the board of directors or the board of judges for this. He had some sort of official role with the Society of Independent Artists, and the annual exhibition that they would mount had the slogan "No jury, no prizes." So you paid your entrance fee, and you were allocated somewhere to exhibit. And Duchamp submitted this, and it was rejected quite marginally, but it was rejected by the other board of directors. I believe the reasoning they gave it was immoral, that it would offend the sensibilities seeing a public urinal in a gallery. So it was hidden behind a screen, and that's how this very famous photograph came to be taken, that Duchamp and his friend Alfred Stieglitz visited the Society of Independent Artists. He took the work out from behind the screen and got Stieglitz to photograph it. Interestingly, that is all that exists of this work now. Nobody knows where it is. If you see it in a museum, rather ironically, it is a Duchamp endorsed replica that was made in the 1960s, which sort of goes against the idea of these things being mass-produced everyday objects, that it's actually become a highly valuable art object because of that. And Duchamp, they went to considerable trouble trying to replicate it from what was available in this photo. And Duchamp was supervising that as a very elderly man. So it is a very, very famous example. It's the one that everyone always talks about, the urinal that is put into the gallery context. And it is the first example of a ready-made. So what on earth was Duchamp thinking? That before this, he'd been a painter in the Cubist idiom, a very famous work of his, again, excuse me, a painting called Nude Descending a Staircase. He painted that in a Cubist style, that it was very, very hard to pick out a nude descending a staircase. It just looks like fractured grey planes. But interestingly, that work was rejected from an open course salon. And so there is some conjecture that Duchamp was stung by that, and this was his opportunity to test it, to test the boundaries of what no jury, no prizes actually means. This quote here is rather important. It's a quote from the time. Whether it was written by Duchamp or his friend Beatrice, well, we don't know, but we do know that Duchamp endorsed it. And it reads thus: "Whether Mr. Mutt with his own hands made the fountain or not has no importance. He chose it. He took an ordinary article of life and placed it so that its useful significance disappeared under the new title and point of view, created a new thought for the object." And that is essentially what the ready-made does. Because in the ready-made, choice becomes the creative act. We are used to thinking of an artist, the creative act is the making of something, actually fabricating it. Duchamp's insight was to see that choice is extremely important. When the object is chosen by the artist, it removes the object's function and it becomes art. So the urinal is no longer usable as a urinal. Therefore, the context has been changed and we now see it as art. The title and the artist's intention give it a new meaning. So Duchamp had realized that the old saying, art is in the eye of the beholder, that there is a truth to that, that an object can be read very, very differently if it was put in a gallery as opposed to a public lavatory. And so choice and the artist's choice becomes all important. So it's very, very important to see that. So the artist is no longer a maker, but the chooser of an art object. Why was he doing this? Well, to boil it down very crudely, Duchamp was questioning the status of the artwork, the artist, and taste. So those things have become tremendously important through the rest of the 20th century. They define it. And that's why it is considered to be so influential, because it created a shockwave. Not many people saw it at the beginning, and not many people were aware of it at the beginning, but it reverberated through the decades with other artists, and it led to a radical revaluation of the role of the artwork in society, the role of the artist, and most particularly the role of taste in deciding these things. Now, it's not totally clear that these were Duchamp just blindly choosing things, because it has been pointed out that all of the ready-mades he found were, for want of a better word, aesthetically pleasing, that they looked quite interesting. And here's a good example of this image, the bottle dryer from 1914. And again, the original is missing, so this is a replica from the 60s. A lot of the time, researchers have discovered that these things weren't as common. They weren't things that you would just buy from Argos or Tesco off the shelf. That they weren't easily found. So there was some level of aesthetic discrimination going on with Duchamp, that it has to be said that all of the ready-mades don't look bland. They do have something to them. So interesting, and it's, I don't want to get too much into the taste issue here, but that is definitely something that needs to be considered. So if we continue this introduction, if we consider the ready-made is very much Duchamp's idea. Ready-made is Duchamp's term. It's almost like got a trademark on it. And the more generic term, so it's a bit like vacuum cleaner versus Hoover. Hoover is the name of a company, whereas more correctly you should call them vacuum cleaners. It's a bit like that with the ready-made, or an objet trouvé. Objet trouvé basically means found object, and it's more or less the same thing as a ready-made. An ordinary object is chosen by an artist and presented as art. Picasso first used newspaper in his Cubist collages from 1912. So many people have pointed to these as one of the first examples of the ready-made, was collaging in newspaper headlines into his work. So it's an interesting intertwined history. It really is essentially the same as a ready-made. There might be philosophical differences where I think we could argue about what Duchamp was doing and what Picasso was doing were very different, but essentially it means the same thing. Here's a famous one by Picasso, Head of a Bull, which is a bronze cast of a bicycle seat and handlebars. Assisted ready-made. So an assisted ready-made was a term that Duchamp used for a ready-made that wasn't just off the peg, that there had been some level of artist intervention into it, that the artist had altered or put an addition onto it. So the example we've got here is Bicycle Wheel from 1913. Again, it's a replica, sort of sanctioned by Duchamp. And it's just a metal wheel mounted on a painted wooden stool, which was by Duchamp. Dada was a movement in art that was more or less around the time of the First World War. They were interested in anti-art, so the idea of the ready-made was of interest to them, that there was a sense of the pointlessness of art in the face of the catastrophe and the loss of life, the senseless loss of life that was in World War I. So Dada and the associated artists were very interested in the ready-made within that respect. Artists that you could look at in research that, the particular ones are Kurt Schwitters, Jean Arp, and Francis Picabia. They're the people to look at for that. Now, after Dada, which is rather short-lived, it goes very quiet through the 20th century. That's not to say people weren't playing with the idea of the ready-made, but it's not as insistent as it was in those earlier years. Duchamp himself allegedly quit making art for about 30 years and became a championship chess player. Whether that's true or not, I really can't say. I think there's a bit more to it than. Now, it went very quiet, and the reason that a lot of Duchamp's works were remade as replicas in the 50s and 60s was because of this so-called Neo-Dada, that there was a resurgence in young artists in the work of Duchamp and the ideas of Duchamp, and that is really decisive in why he has become so important in the years that have, in the post-war years in contemporary art. It's why his importance has risen. I think by World War II, people would have said, if you said the most important artists in the world, I think you probably would have got Matisse and Picasso. But post-war, it becomes complicated, and Duchamp suddenly comes from nowhere to become very, very important indeed for a whole generation of young artists. They return to the ideas of the ready-made, most notably Robert Rauschenberg and Jasper Johns, and this is a combined work by Robert Rauschenberg, which is basically junk that he found walking around his studio in New York that he would put together rather like an assisted ready-made, but there'd be painting. So the areas that look painted, that's the paintwork by Rauschenberg in there. So if you look at what it's made of, it's very eclectic. It's a very long list of materials: oil, paper, fabric, printed reproductions, metal, wood, rubber shoe heel, tennis ball on canvas with oil and rubber tile on an Angora goat and wood platform mounted on 4 casters. So a lot's gone into that work. It's worth noting that the other major movement that Rauschenberg and Johns came from was abstract expressionism. And you can see that in the brushwork, that there's an absolute affinity to what was going on. They were in that world, they were in that New York of the 50s New York, but they were the younger generation, and they didn't really feel an affinity with the people. You know, that they certainly socialized with them. They knew the people, Pollock, de Kooning, Klein, you know, Rothko, Newman. They knew all of these people, but they were certainly older than them. And as gay men, they really felt isolated from there was a very macho bent to abstract expressionism that they never felt entirely at home with. And that's kind of in their work. They smash up the purity of abstract expressionism. And we're going back to ideas of taste again, because very important in that was the formulations of the critic Clement Greenberg, and his ideas are all around taste. He was in New York at this time. He was the man who put a lot of the theory behind abstract expressionism. They saw that as not fitting, and they wanted to bring an impurity, bring a dialogue with the real world, the world that they saw around them in New York, the strange collisions and clashes. So they are both very important. Johns is still with us, albeit quite elderly now, and Rauschenberg, they're both very, very important artists to today, even though they were working about 60 odd years ago. They're still rather important. From Neo-Dada art, it isn't far to go to pop art. How do we describe pop art? Well, I'm sure you've all got an image, and I'm sure that image you have of pop art is this. the Campbell Soup, or maybe Marilyn Monroe by Andy Warhol. The word pop art was actually coined by a British artist, Richard Hamilton. And this is what he wrote in 1957 about pop art. Pop art is popular, designed for mass audience, transient, short-term solution, expendable, easily forgotten, low cost, mass produced, young, aimed at youth, witty, sexy, gimmicky, glamorous, big business. I think most people are very familiar with pop art, probably through the work of Andy Warhol. It is intrinsically related to the ready-made. If you think about what we were talking about, the ready-made as this found object, this found thing, well, you can see that this is the two-dimensional version of it, what Warhol is doing, these mass-produced objects that are photographs and they're being reproduced. Again, there is a question of taste at play here. You know, that these short circuit ideas of composition, they short circuit ideas of judgment. You know, we've spoken about trying to work out when a painting works by thinking about composition, about balance and rightness. Well, you lose a lot of those problems when you're just appropriating an image. You get around that because you are questioning those ideas of taste and judgment. So what would they be doing? They would be using found images from the press or popular culture. Found objects also go into their work. Artists that you may find interesting in this respect are Klaus Oldenburg and Edoardo Palazzi. Warhol is obviously one of the really big ones, as is Richard Hamilton. Look at Richard Hamilton's work. You'll find him to be rather interesting as well within a dialogue about what we're talking about here. So that's pop art. So that's roughly, if we're talking chronologically, you know, it's crude as well because there's always an overlap. This is probably 50s to 60s. This is kind of the 60s, and it begins to lose sway by the 70s. That it's crested, and something else swings in. The pendulum of the art world swings in, and almost as a counter move against the kind of glamour and excess of pop art, you have the austerity of conceptual art. So conceptual art properly was named by Sol LeWitt, the artist, in his paragraphs on conceptual art. It really took hold across the art world by the 70s, was when people were making self-confessedly conceptual art. In conceptual art, the idea or concept is the most important aspect of the work. When an artist uses conceptual form of art, it means that all of the planning and decisions are made beforehand and the execution is a perfunctory affair. So again, you can see how the ready-made would fit into conceptual art and why it was of interest to conceptual artists. The work I've put here is by an American artist who's been resident in Britain for about 50 years, Michael Craig Martin. And it's called An Oak Tree. It is in the Tate's collection. You can go and see it in the Tate. And it is a glass of water that Michael Craig Martin says is an oak tree. And if you want to go into that more, read up about it. The Tate glossary, the Tate website for this is very good. If you look it up, they have an extremely interesting essay written about it that will explain to you some of the reasons why Craig Martin was doing this. They all relate back to Duchamp, they all relate back to the ready-made, and they all relate back to ideas of choice and judgment and taste that we've been talking about. Other artists you may find interesting to look at for conceptual art's use of the ready-made is John Baltazari and Joseph Kosuth. Postmodernism. So after conceptual art, again, I'm making it seem like this just moves in like easy sort of segments. It doesn't. It's very blurry. You know, lots of artists could be called postmodern or conceptual. So be careful about labels, that they really are only of use to museums and categorizing things. In reality, it's much more blurry, it's much more open-ended than that. But it's useful when we're trying to break it down for you to make sense of it. Postmodernism really was used as a proper term for art practice in the late 70s, but it was only in the 80s that people picked up on it. In postmodernism, artists would use ready-made objects to question originality, consumerism, and identity. The work I've shown here is Jeff Koons's 3-ball total equilibrium tank, 2 Dr. J Silver Series Spalding NBA tip-off. That's a long title again, from 1985, which is basketballs, glass, a tank and water, a glass tank and water. Jeff Koons is an extremely influential artist today. All of his work revolves around the ready-made. It's interesting to note that before he really got started as an artist, he actually worked on Wall Street as a commodities broker, which maybe tells you something about his mindset, where he was coming from as an artist. 3 other artists that would be very useful for you to research in terms of conceptual art are Jenny Holzer, Martha Russler, and Barbara Kruger. Appropriation art. So this is really a splinter of postmodernism, but it's worth talking about as a thing in itself because it's very, very closely linked to the idea of the ready-made. In appropriation art, artists deliberately choose to use the work of other artists as a kind of ready-made to change their meaning. And look at the work we've got here. This is by Sherry Levine from 1996 called Fountain Buddha. And what is it? Well, it's a replica of Marcel Duchamp's original fountain, and she's called it Buddha. It's interesting to note that at the time, this is what a lot of people thought when they saw Duchamp's in the 1920s, 19-teens. People are, I think Stieglitz, the guy who took the photo of it, actually referred to it as looking like a Buddha and saying it was a very aesthetically pleasing object, the way Duchamp positioned it. So Levine is playing with this. When you see these in a gallery, it's not just one you see a series of kind of 20. It almost looks like seeing something in a hall of mirrors where there's just about 20 of them stretching out in the line. So it looks like they're in a factory or on a production line. So Sherry Levine, very, very important appropriation artist, someone well worth looking at if you're interested in appropriation art. Other very important names for appropriation art are Richard Prince, Elaine Sturtevant, and Fred Wilson. YBA, so this is the young British artists of the 80s to 90s. You may have heard of them. Some of them were actually taught by Michael Craig Martin at Goldsmiths, who we looked at with the oak tree. So that gives you an idea of where they're coming from in terms of their use of ready-mades. They kind of mixed the idea of ready-made, conceptual art, postmodernism. It all kind of gets mixed up in their work and repackaged as something quite of the moment. That they were very big in the 90s. So the ones that are worth looking at: Damien Hirst, Sarah Lucas, and Rachel White-Reed. All of those are worth looking at. Their relationship to ready-made objects will be rewarding to do a bit of research on. This is one of the most infamous examples of a ready-made in the last 25 years. Tracy Emin's My Bed. I'm sure you've all heard of that, and you can do some extra research on it. And finally, we talk about contemporary art. So that's art made in the last 20 or so years. Many contemporary artists use found objects or ready-made in their work. It's no longer considered to be as radical as it was in the 20th century. Artists use it as another way of making now. So that idea of choice being important has become so embedded in art practice that it's no longer even challenging in the way that it was when Duchamp did it, that it's accepted as part of the dialogue now. Which is good, that it means that so many more things are available to artists, that nothing really is out of the bounds of what an artist can use. And that doesn't mean you just have to make a painting or a drawing of it. You can actually take the whole thing and use it as is in your work. The example I've got here is quite a young artist who won the Turner Prize a few years ago, called Helen Martin. It's all found objects in that work. Other artists to look at are Seal Floyer, Lucy Skyer, Carla Black and Tavares Strachan. So that shows you, it's interesting to conclude really, that's the last slide, but the conclusion is if you look at the journey from Duchamp to now, that it's one of normalization of the ready-made, that it's gone from being a very esoteric, unknown thing to something that is used by most artists, you know, that there's an element of it everywhere. You could find it interesting to think about the idea of the ready-made and think about a painter such as Gerhard Richter, who has often suggested his paintings function as ready-mades, but I think that's for another day. It's at that point I'm going to stop. So I hope it's given you something to think about, and most importantly, things to research and hopefully fuel your own art practice and own experiments. And thank you for listening. And I look forward to seeing your own ready-mades as they appear in the studio. Thanks a lot. Goodbye.